This is part one in the workshop series, Suicide Prevention for Young Children, resource guided workshops for elementary school personnel and parents and caregivers. Today's session is designed to serve school personnel's work around self-harm and suicide awareness and prevention in childhood and early adolescence. We know how important this topic is. My name is Tina Rocha. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am joining you from Orange, California, and I am part of the Center for Applied Research Solutions team. My absolute pleasure to introduce our presenters, Dr. Megan O'Malley, PhD and licensed psychologist, Frances Marion, licensed clinical social worker, and Jessica Palacio, licensed clinical social worker.
Thank you, Tina, for getting us started. I can introduce myself. My name is Frances Marion. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. I come to this work as a queer, white, Jewish woman living on Tovangar, colonially known as Los Angeles. And just for a visual description, I have a short brown mullet and wearing glasses and a blue button-down shirt. And just as far as my background, I've practiced in Wisconsin, in Washington, D.C., and now in California. My background is in community mental health, HIV and AIDS care, and for the last 10 years or so in school social work. I currently work supporting doing training and consultation around bullying prevention, specifically related to race, gender, and sexual orientation. So I'm excited to be here today, and I will pass it on to Megan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Megan O'Malley. I am a licensed psychologist, licensed educational psychologist, and nationally certified school psychologist. Little shout out to the school psychs in the group. My background, I worked full-time as a school psychologist for 6 years and simultaneously went back to get my doctorate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. My doctorate's in counseling, clinical, and school psychology. My current work is primarily, I'm a trainer of school psychologists at Sacramento State University, and I maintain an active research agenda around school mental health, systems work in school mental health, as well as school climate, like dimensions of school climate and school bullying reduction. And I'll hand it to Jessica.
Okay, hi everyone. Okay, so my name is Jessica Palacio, and I was raised by two Belizean immigrants who are of the Garifuna ethnicity. I have studied social work and I practice social work in the state of California. I have worked in group homes, psychiatric hospitals, emergency rooms, and schools for the past 5 years.
First, we're going to go over suicide awareness for educators. We'll go over what is suicide, what are more the broad term that we'll use are suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And we use the acronym STB to encompass a variety of different terms. We'll talk about suicide-related risk factors and warning signs. We'll go over what is the difference between a risk factor and a warning sign, as well as some of the common risk factors and warning signs. We'll talk a bit about disparities in rates of suicide, as well as access to mental health care. We'll talk about protective factors and assets for suicide prevention. We'll also talk about taking action for safety. We'll go over phases of a response cycle when we learn that a child may be experiencing suicidal thoughts or behaviors. We'll be talking about how to communicate effectively with caregivers and parents, as well as how to develop a safety plan, key aspects of a safety plan. Then we'll go over school safety, school-based prevention and intervention efforts. We'll go over some of the key evidence-based approaches. And of course, we recognize that we only have you for another hour, And that is less time than we certainly need to cover everything in the product, in the written document. So Franny went ahead and posted the document there. You'll find that it's, I think it's somewhere around like maybe 35 or 40 pages long and has a lot more detail than we're able to share now. Today's presentation is really designed to provide an introduction. We recognize that most participants today were going to be clinicians, and I think we rightly predicted that. So just know that we acknowledge your training as clinicians, and much of what we'll go over today is we'll touch on things you probably already know, but it'll be a good refresher. And we'll be organizing the way we speak to this work around how to help educators who are non-clinical, don't have the same clinical training as most of the participants on this webinar, how to do this work in a way that invites educators who don't have your same training into the conversation. All right, so talking a little bit about language throughout the written document that we produced, we use the phrase suicidal thoughts and behaviors, or STBs. This is meant to encompass a variety of terms, 3 of which I'll go over here. First, suicidal ideation refers to thinking about, considering, or planning death by suicide. Suicide attempt refers to an act with the intent to die that does not result in death. A suicide attempt may or may not result in physical injury. Non-suicidal self-injury, sometimes referred to as self-harm, refers to injuries inflicted to the body without suicidal intent. It's good to build our comfort with using the correct terms and to avoid using euphemisms. Also to help educators that we work with and model for the educators that we work with the use of the accurate terms. Speaking of that, why do we use the phrase death by suicide instead of the phrase committed suicide? We are looking to communicate a neutral and non-judgmental stance, and we're really seeking to avoid reinforcing stigma, misunderstandings, and myths about suicide and suicidal thoughts and behaviors more generally. We really are looking to help educators adopt this neutral, non-judgmental language. We know that from ages 5 to 9, according to the most recent NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health data, suicide is rare. It's the 10th leading cause of death for children ages 5 to 9. When children reach that pre-adolescent stage of age 10, however, the suicide becomes the 2nd leading cause of death for children ages 10 to 12. And we're really organized, this webinar and these resources are really organized to help elementary aged educators, caregivers, and parents work with children who may be at risk of or experiencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors. We know that although for the younger ages 5 to 9, suicide is rare. However, we know that suicidal thoughts and behaviors in early childhood do predict later suicidal thoughts and behaviors in early adolescence, and early adulthood.
How do you confront or correct someone who says they committed suicide?
That's a really good question. And I think, I invite my co-speakers to speak to this a little bit too. I tend to try to model the behavior and try to model the language and correct the language when I speak. If a person says to me they committed suicide, my reflection will be, I'm sorry to hear they died by suicide. So I model the language rather than being like directly confrontative, because that can make people feel shamed and withdraw from the conversation. Franny or Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I'd like to share. I think I've actually been having this conversation a lot lately, just with friends, like non-social work friends. And so what I usually explain is that using the word committed has this like reference of like criminalization and like they did something bad, right? Or they've committed some type of crime. But in this case, this person died by suicide. Likely they were suffering from something very serious. And so I'll usually share that explanation, and then as well as Megan, I'll model using the term died by suicide, just in the way that I'm speaking about a situation. I recently had this exact conversation with someone regarding a really popular death in the media, or suicide death in the media, which was coming up. A lot of people were actually reaching out to me and asking me about it, and that provided an opportunity. So I feel like we are presented with opportunities to have that discussion. And it doesn't have to be this this thing where we're correcting people and you shouldn't say this. It's just really providing that education that we should be using the term died by suicide versus committed suicide.
Many of us are confronting the challenge of myths and misunderstandings about suffering that happens around individuals who are experiencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So I appreciate the compassion, and I appreciate the willingness to consider alternative language that is more consistent with a compassionate frame. So turning our attention to risk factors and warning signs, it's not uncommon for individuals without our clinical training to mix up risk factors and warning signs. So one thing we can do for educators and non-clinical staff is help them understand the difference. Risk factors are characteristics or conditions that increase the chance that someone would consider suicide. And warning signs are indicators that someone may be considering suicide right now. If warning signs are present, knowing the risk factors is helpful for understanding the level of risk. We want, when educators observe warning signs, we want educators to be making referrals to our trained staff to be doing a deeper level of risk analysis.
Okay, so as Megan mentioned, risk factors are things that actually increase the chance that someone would even consider suicide. So most of you guys were really on point with your Mentimeter responses, but I'll go through some of the things that we are seeing commonly in schools. So some risk factors include trauma or other stressful life events, such as emotional, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, or even domestic violence can be a risk factor. Peer-related problems, including experiencing bullying, which we know can be physical, social, verbal, even cyber, and even being the bully themselves can be a risk factor. I don't think we always think of it in those terms, but not just the person being bullied, but the person who's doing the bullying may be, dealing with some of their own stressors. Being rejected by family, which can be due to sexual orientation, gender identity, or other reasons. The student's personal or family history of mental health issues or medical conditions, and even substance abuse challenges. In fact, more than 1 in 3 people who die by suicide are found to be under the influence of a substance. And I will also say that our elementary students are not exempt from this, as vaping and use of marijuana is sadly common on elementary campuses, in my experience. A student's history of suicide attempts, as well as the student's family history of suicide, or even just knowing a close friend who died by suicide, can also be a risk factor. Recent loss or separation. We've seen lots of students who recently lost someone during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was not that long ago, or other losses. Is also a risk factor. And lastly, just having access to lethal means such as firearms, knives, medications, all of those things heighten the student's level of risk tremendously And so all of those are risk factors. Next slide, please. Okay, so I like to think of warning signs as like red flags or indicators that a person might be at risk for suicide or that they might urgently need help. And so this could include significant or dramatic changes. And these could be changes in their mood or in their behavior. It can include like new or impulsive or risky behaviors that maybe we weren't seeing before. It can be also unexplained drops in their academic performance or social withdrawal, social isolation, all of those things I would say are red flags. For example, a student who, let's say you have a student, right, and they are very engaging in their schoolwork, they're your all-star student, you know, they're a great student, they're always there. And then suddenly you notice like now they're not showing up to school, they're not motivated, they're not focused, they're not turning in assignments. Those could be warning signs as well. In addition to that, we may also see uncomfortable feelings such as fatigue or anger. So I think someone mentioned that earlier, irritability, sadness, loss of interest, right, in doing things that they used to like to do, or even other depressive symptoms. These things can also include self-injurious behaviors such as cutting, burning, etc. Most certainly are warning signs. And then expressing suicidal ideations or even suicidal threats, as well as the preoccupation with death, right? These things can be directly or even indirectly expressed through verbal statements, writings, drawings, even social media posts. Actually, very commonly social media posts. Or maybe students, they're pretending to, like they do pretend play with themes of death, or they make statements, just flat out statements of, I wish I could disappear, or I hate my life, or no one would miss me if I was gone. Things like that. I've actually assessed students who were searching on YouTube, you know, how to kill myself, or how to tie a noose, or researching other things related to death and suicide. And in addition to those things, frequent visits to the school nurse with like vague physical complaints such as stomach aches and headaches, that could also be a warning sign. Impulsive or reckless behavior, maybe they're not caring about the consequences, they have no concern for their own safety. And then lastly, I just want to add that many times we'll see that the students might be making final arrangements. Maybe they write a suicide note or a goodbye letters to their parents or their close friends, or they might post that goodbye message on social media, which we have seen that as well.
Okay, so I'll do a little bit of a highlight on self-injury and then we'll turn it over to Franny. So for self-injury, as I said, a particular type of suicidal thought and behavior that may or may not actually have a suicidal intent. That said, even if we find that the child is not suicidal, if they rely on self-injury to cope with emotions, then we do need to intervene to provide supports. We need to intervene with a mental health professional, of course, to help them find coping strategies that are more developmentally appropriate. So self-injury, things that you can train educators to be aware of and be noticing. This is where our K through 6 educators can really be the eyes and ears on the ground, and then referring to our clinicians as needed. So our educators can be looking for physical signs of injury, that a child might scratch themselves with their fingernails or objects, cutting their skin or burning their skin, particularly with erasers, objects that are common in their environments, hitting or choking themselves, picking at their skin, causing their nails to bleed, pulling their own hair, or maybe slapping, hitting, or banging their head against a wall or hard surfaces, desks, sometimes going under a table and hitting their head on the top of the table. Those are things to be on the lookout for. Warning signs to be looking for, and to help educators as well as parents and caregivers look for is any kind of razors or sharp objects that the child has on their person, any writing or talking about self-injury, posting comments, pictures, and stories about self-injury, writing about this in their classwork, drawing pictures, doing pretend play where their pretend play objects injure themselves, noticing if a child is wearing long sleeves in weather that would not, in warm weather where you wouldn't really need long sleeves, any kind of like bracelets and extra jewelry that might be covering self-injury wounds, and avoiding activities that children ordinarily really like to do, like swimming and things where they're going to have to, where their skin might be on display for people to see, and where those self-injury injury scars may be present and observed.
Okay, so as we've touched on so far, the rates of suicide risk are not the same for all young people. And that's true in elementary as well. So we want to focus on some of our highest risk students. And as Megan mentioned before, these are often our students that carry identities that are marginalized or multiple marginalized identities. So I want to just give you a second to read these statistics quietly to yourself. And as you're reading them, maybe think about what some of the possible explanations might be for these disparities. The ones we've highlighted today talk about specifically race, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So I'll give you just a minute to look at those yourself. Thankfully, we also know as clinicians, and we want to make sure that educators also understand what protective factors exist. Many of our students may have risk factors that increase their vulnerabilities, but we also know that there are many protective factors that schools in particular have an ability to influence that can mitigate that risk. So here, just to name a few, and there's more in our resource, but being able to, speaking to the marginalized identities before, having positive racial socialization, having LGBT affirming environments, and providing that education to parents as well. Helping students with the basic competencies around recognizing when they or a peer may be experiencing symptoms of a mental health condition, and how to ask for help and to have people they can go to. And of course, experiencing success, whether that's academically or through extracurriculars, and having that sense of belonging both at school and in the broader community. We want to try to help illustrate some of the concepts we've been talking about and through a case study. So Leilani is a third grader who's new to your school. She and her mother live in a nearby transitional living center. Her mother's work schedule prevents her from attending in-person school activities. However, she stays in close communication with Leilani's teacher. Leilani participates in the after-school program. While she's always been quiet, she appears increasingly withdrawn and sad. Instead of playing Foursquare like she used to, she's taken to drawing alone. An employee of the after-school program checks on her one day and asks to see her picture. She shows a gruesome image of a girl with blood coming from her eyes. When the employee asks her about it, she says, "This is me." So some of the questions we'd like you to consider are: what risk factors or warning signs might there be? And again, you might have to be making some guesses or assumptions based off of the limited information you have, but what are some possible risk factors or warning signs? What are some protective factors that you can see? And then what questions, what more information do you need to be able to adequately assess whether there's suicide risk here, what the risk level is? What questions might you ask this third grader? So we might assume that there's risk factors connected to that, right? Not having stable housing for any number of reasons. If you look at the brief, there's kind of some more backstory for Leilani, and we learned that mom was leaving a violent relationship. So that is a protective factor as well, that mom has taken those steps to access help and hopefully be connected to more resources. And coming from a really non-judgmental, like calm, matter-of-fact place, especially with little kids, we know how important that is to not unintentionally influence their answers by our emotional response, right? But knowing that also we need to be explicit, and if there was potentially some trauma that led to her being in a transitional living center, and we want to learn more about how she's been able to get support or cope with that. So I invite you to read our resource for more backstory on Leilani and how her safety plan looks, but we will go back to the slides for now, and we'll have a chance to come back to her story.
Okay, so let's talk about suicide response. Of course, there's never enough time to go into all the details about suicide response, and we will continue to reference you back to the very detailed resource that we are pulling some specific pieces from. So school-based clinicians, many of whom are on this call, have an important role to play in building and sustaining systems for predictable STB response for schools, so that the educators you work with can sleep at night knowing that they can rely on a system of care that is reliable and is going to intervene appropriately if they identify warning signs of suicidal thoughts and behaviors for the children in their classrooms. The phases of suicide response are going to include responding immediately. I'll go into a little bit more detail. Securing the safety of a student who's experiencing suicidal thoughts or behaviors. Assessing for suicide risk. Communicating with the child's parents, guardians, caregivers, and creating a safety plan. What's not pictured here is the more general preparedness that needs to happen so that you're ready to respond when an educator refers for having observed any kind of warning sign of STB. So preparing to respond, make sure that you familiarize yourself with relevant laws and policies associated with your state and locale for what's expected of school-based practitioners for response. And many of you are not operating in schools, so you may have your own set of policies and laws, and also if you interact with schools, they may have their own set of policies and laws, and they vary by state and region. You're going to want to identify and train a group of staff who are capable and appropriately trained to conduct risk assessments. If an educator who's a non-clinical staff, if you have appropriately trained them to be on the lookout for warning signs, and indeed they find a child who is expressing some of those warning signs and they refer, then there needs to be a set of staff who have the appropriate training to do that risk evaluation. You need to be prepared to have children understand the limits of confidentiality in the context of risk assessment. You need to be prepared to ask a child directly if they're thinking of hurting themselves or killing themselves, and get really curious about why that might be. Taking a position of curiosity and non-judgment, and also trying to stay as clear and developmentally appropriate as possible, avoiding euphemisms, avoiding figures of speech. You're going to need to use a calm, non-judgmental tone, and really critically emphasize that the student is not in trouble. We emphasize this throughout. In our next webinar, we're going to be talking about working with parents and caregivers and how critical it is the child not left thinking that they're in trouble as a consequence of expressing suicidal thoughts or behaviors. And of course, whenever we're working with young children, we can incorporate tools and techniques for helping young people communicate. We may need to rephrase directions. We may need to have play-based conversations involving the various tools that we use, dolls, drawing, puzzle games, things like that, to help young people in early childhood be able to have those conversations and facilitate that conversation in a developmentally appropriate way. We're going to go over more of these phases in a little bit more detail in the next few slides.
Thank you. On the next slide, we're going to go back again to hear from you all and the expertise in the room. What are some things, like specifically thinking about phrases that you've used when trying to assess risk level in kids in elementary age? So this would be the next slide. And I want you to think about things like time, right? So we're trying to assess the risk level. Sometimes we might ask something like, oh, well, have you been feeling that way recently? What does recently mean to a kindergartner? What does recently mean to a fourth grader, right? And so using some examples might be using markers, time markers, such as, did that happen before break or after winter break? Did that happen when Ms. Palacio was your teacher or Ms. Chavez? So getting real concrete with kids. Also thinking about things like lethality. Sometimes if a student doesn't have, we might ask, have you ever tried to kill yourself before? And they say, yeah. And I tried to jump off the swing set. And that may not seem like a lethal attempt, or we may know from our adult perspective that the likelihood of it being lethal is small, but that doesn't take away from the fact that that is an attempt in that child's eyes, right? So what are some other questions that you might ask to assess risk level? Again, maybe just drawing from some of your own experiences of working with young kids. I'm seeing in the chat, making sure that they understand the meaning of death. Yes, so that there's some more detail in our resource about how to, and that might be also in the parent resource, about what does it mean to die, right? And see what they say. And if you die, is that something like you can come back, or is that forever? And asking those concrete questions to understand. I'm also seeing a reference to the weather, helping kids make sense of time based on the weather or the seasons.
Yes. Okay. So when we're communicating with parents and guardians to address mental health concerns, it's important to remember that they might be feeling shame or judgment, right? We know that the student is dealing with their own issues, but as we're sharing this information with the parent, it could potentially scare them, right? It might cause them to feel like they're being judged or like we're judging them when we're making this phone call. So it's really important to remember that these are sensitive, very, very sensitive conversations that we're having with these parents and guardians, and that they should be conducted from a place of empathy as well as compassion. We're going to want to notify parents and caregivers of any warning signs of suicidal ideations or self-injurious behaviors as soon as we know about them. Or I guess it depends on what setting you're working in. Maybe there's a certain protocol, maybe there's someone that you need to inform prior to the parent. But you also want to emphasize neither they nor their child are in trouble, and to certainly reiterate your desire to support the family. I think in my experience, using the word support within the conversation takes me a long way, right? I'm able to keep them on the phone a little bit longer and really have this deep dialogue and conversation around what's going on with the student and how can we be of service? How can we help while they're at school? And then, of course, discussing ways that they can support their own child when they're at home. And then gathering additional and relevant information from caregivers to understand the risk level. So when we are conducting suicide risk assessments, we actually cannot determine the level of risk without speaking to the parent. The parent component and the parent's response plays a huge part in the level of risk within the assessment. Because the parent could say, yeah, well, they say that all the time, or they do that all the time. This is no big deal, whatever, let's move on, right? In other words, they're being dismissive. On the other side of that, they could be so sad, maybe they just start bawling, they're crying right in front of you, right? So it's important to know that the range of the responses, right, can definitely and certainly range, and that we should be, ready to take a dive into those conversations, and again, from a place of empathy and compassion. And then lastly, to connect families to community resources, such as medical and community mental health care providers. We also understand that right now, and I know for sure in California, there's a shortage, right? There's a lot of waitlisting in these community agencies, but I think even just getting the ball rolling and really providing that linkage and referral in whatever way that we can. And so on this slide here, we're talking now about safety planning. So when we are doing or conducting suicide risk assessments, we determine a level of risk. And typically when we've determined that the student is low, moderate, or high, depending on where you work, we're going to want a safety plan. No matter what risk, really, we're going to want a safety plan. We need to make sure that this child, no matter what it is that they said or that they did, that there's a discussion and that we're preventing that from happening again. Schools should make a safety plan with each child who has identified with a suicide risk. And in addition to referrals to outside mental health professionals, schools should also create developmentally appropriate plan with the student and their caregivers. So on your screen now, you are actually seeing an example of a widely used safety plan, right? And to include the components of where we're asking the child about their triggers, right? Their warning signs. We want to know from them what it is that causes them to feel sad or causes them to think about death. And we also want to know what it does to their bodies, right? What are the warning signs? And so this particular safety plan is used with elementary school students. On page 2, the image in the middle, this is where a lot of times we'll give the student a crayon or a pencil and we'll let them fill in, what their face looks like when they're feeling these feelings, when they're triggered, right? So we make it really all connect. And then of course, we want to know from them, who are their trusted adults? Who can they identify to support them at home and also to support them at school? Many times students have trouble identifying adults, not all the time, but sometimes. And so that can be also our opportunity to say, hey, maybe you don't know me that well, or maybe you do, but I can be on your safety plan. Sometimes it kind of helps and gets the conversation going around supporting the student. And yes, so, and then also, I just wanted to add that Oh, coping skills. I knew I was missing one thing. So the hugest part about, I think for me, about safety planning is really helping the student to identify their coping skills. And if so, depending on your role, even practicing those coping skills with that student, and or even speaking to the teacher about their coping skills and encouraging the teacher to reinforce those coping skills or remind the student about using their coping skills when they're needed. And then of course, asking for help. So we of course are supporting the families and making the child's environment safer. And we can assist the parents and guardians in managing the environment in many ways. This includes at school. So if possible and relevant, the student's classroom can be changed from upstairs to downstairs. I've been in a situation where we had a first grade student who was on the second floor, and her go-to every time she was triggered was to attempt to jump off of the second floor, right? And so that prompted us to immediately, problem solve and get her switched to a first floor classroom. So things like that. Having an adult escort them for bathroom breaks or have them use the nurse's restroom. This is specifically if we know that the student is at maybe a moderate or a high risk for suicidal ideation, or maybe even they have a history of self-injurious behaviors. Maybe they're cutting in the bathroom, which we've seen. We want to restrict access to sharp objects like pencil sharpeners, razor blades, which students often bring with them to school, I will add. We know razor blades are not provided by school, but students will bring them and they'll use them at school. So we can ask caregivers to look through belongings before school. In some cases, you can even have the parents sign a search of belongings document, and that can be part of a safety plan protocol on a regular basis. It really just depends. Everything is really case by case. But we want to provide structured activities for recess, such as board games or lunch bunch with a trusted adult. So these are just some things that the school can do to really support the student. And then at home, we can encourage parents to secure all medications away in a locked box. Having that conversation is really, really important. And then as well as removing guns or other weapons from the home. And locking up knives and sharp objects is a really big one. And then having the children keep doors open and ensure adequate supervision by trusted adults. So these are some of the things that we can share with the parent as we're having those very sensitive conversations. These are some suggestions that we can make to the parent for them to support their child and keep them safe at home.
For those of you who work in schools, you know that you can't go to a professional learning opportunity these days without seeing a triangle, right? Where you have your universal, targeted, and intensive intervention supports. We know that our universal are designed for all kids, targeted are designed for children who have some level of risk but may not be experiencing warning signs yet. And then at our intensive level is for those kids who are already being referred for warning signs and need safety plans. Our universals at the universal level, we have several recommendations and suggestions for universal social, emotional, and mental health screening. We have recommendations for universal social, emotional learning programs and other references for you to link to for judging the quality of evidence for those interventions. We suggest gatekeeper trainings to train educators who are non-clinical staff on those warning signs and risk factors and how to be on the lookout and how to appropriately respond within the context of their training. So we provide several links to gatekeeper trainings. We provide example policy language for anti-bullying policies to address issues of discrimination, bias, and stigma on school campuses. We have recommendations for positive behavioral supports as well as restorative restorative practices for discipline. At the targeted level, we provide you, so again, targeted level is for kids who have some risk factors, but maybe are not actively showing warning signs of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And for those, the targeted supports include small group social emotional interventions to support coping skills, to better understand the context of children's lives, to connect with mentoring and extracurricular engaging activities that kind of in the balance of risk and protective factors that we put more weight onto the assets and protective supports in children's lives. And then in the intensive supports, this is where we're focused on the kids who really do have some warning signs of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And this is where your safety planning is going to happen. And so any child who's at that intensive level really should have a safety plan. And we provide additional recommendations for trauma-informed approaches and treatment supports at the individual, more intensive therapeutic treatment for young children experiencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors.
Thank you, Dr. Megan O'Malley, Jessica Palacio, as well as Frances Marion, and to everybody that's joined us for today. Please remember that we're coming back. This is part 1 of 2